When a wildfire threatened Miles Smith's home, a team of firefighters arrived on the scene. But instead of saving his family, they let the flames destroy everything, mocked and ignored Miles, faced unimaginable loss. But what happened next? Subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the hills of Los Angeles. Uplifting music hummed quietly in the background as Miles Smith stood by the large floor-to-ceiling windows of his modern mansion. He held the steaming cup of coffee, savoring a rare moment of peace. His wife Lila was reading on the couch while their children, Miles and Jaden, were busy laughing over a board game spread out across the living room floor. The calmness of the evening was interrupted by a faint, almost distant roar. At first it seemed like the distant rumble of an airplane. Miles glanced outside, scanning the horizon, and that's when he saw it, a sinister orange glow creeping over the hills. Thin plumes of smoke began to rise, painting the twilight sky in ominous hues. Miles's chest tightened. Fires weren't uncommon in Los Angeles, but this time the glow seemed unnervingly close. He set his coffee down and walked over to Lila, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Hey babe, look at this," he said, gesturing toward the window. Lila followed his gaze and immediately put down her book, a worried frown creasing her face. "That's close," she murmured, standing up to get a better view. "We should call someone, find out what's happening." Miles nodded, already reaching for his phone. A few taps later, he was on the line with the local fire department. After several rings, a curt voice answered, "Los Angeles Fire Services, what's your emergency?" Miles quickly explained the situation, detailing the proximity of the fire to his home. The operator's response was far from reassuring. "Sir, we're aware of the fire in your area. All units are currently deployed. Please evacuate if necessary. We'll do our best to respond." Miles's brows knitted together. "Do your best. This is a residential area. There are families here." The operator's voice remained robotic. "We'll send assistance as soon as possible. Goodbye." The call ended abruptly, leaving Miles staring at his phone in disbelief. He turned to Lila, shaking his head. "They're overwhelmed, said to evacuate if we have to." Lila's face darkened. "This is our home, Miles. Where are we supposed to go on such short notice?" "I'll figure it out," he replied, trying to sound confident, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. As the evening wore on, the glow outside intensified. Winds picked up, carrying the acrid smell of smoke. Embers began to dance in the air, tiny sparks of destruction that signaled the fire's proximity. Miles's phone buzzed with text messages from neighbors and friends, all sharing the same grim updates. The fire was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. In the chaos, Miles gathered his family together in the living room. His voice was calm but firm as he laid out their plan. "We're packing up essentials, just in case. Clothes, IDs, anything we don't want to lose. Everyone got that?" Jaden raised his hand, trying to lighten the mood. "Does this mean I can't bring my entire sneaker collection?" Miles chuckled dryly, but the tension didn't leave his face. "One pair, man. Let's go." As the family scattered to gather their belongings, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Outside, the once distant roar of the fire grew louder, almost deafening. The orange glow transformed into a blazing wall of fire that illuminated the night sky. By the time the family reconvened, their suitcases were packed, and the air in the house had turned thick with smoke. Miles tried calling the fire department again, but this time the line was busy. He cursed under his breath, feeling a rare wave of helplessness. Moments later, a loud knock on the door startled everyone. Miles hurried to open it, finding their neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Linda, standing there with tears in her eyes. "Miles, it's bad, real bad," she said, her voice trembling. "The fire's already taken the Murphy's house down the hill. You need to leave now." Miles glanced back at his family, then back at Linda. "We're almost ready. Thanks for warning us. You stay safe, okay?" Linda nodded and hurried off, disappearing into the smoky night. Back inside, Lila turned to Miles with a worried look. "What do we do if they don't come? What if it's too late?" "They'll come," Miles replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "They have to." Outside, the wind howled, and the glow of the fire seemed impossibly close. Miles stepped onto the patio, watching as the flames licked at the edges of the property. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they seemed so far away, like a hollow promise. For the first time in years, Miles Smith, the action hero, the larger-than-life figure, felt small and powerless. As he stood there staring into the abyss of fire creeping closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more than just his home was at stake. The faint sound of sirens finally broke through the cacophony of roaring flames and whipping winds. Miles turned his head sharply toward the driveway, relief momentarily washing over him as a fire truck emerged from the smoky darkness, its red and white lights piercing the thick haze, casting flickering shadows across the property. Behind him, Lila stepped out onto the patio, clutching her phone in one hand and shielding her eyes from the embers with the other. "They're here," Miles said, exhaling deeply. He glanced at her, his expression cautious but hopeful. "We'll get through this." The truck rolled to a stop, its engine rumbling loudly. A team of 5 firefighters climbed out, moving with a deliberate slowness that felt completely at odds with the urgency of the situation. Miles's eyes narrowed as he noticed their lackadaisical demeanor. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard, approached Miles with an almost casual stride, his uniform spotless, as if he'd barely been working all night. "You the homeowner?" the man asked, his voice gruff but disinterested. "Yeah, I'm Miles Smith," Miles replied, stepping forward. "Thank God you're here. The fire is right on us. We need—" The firefighter held up a hand, cutting him off, his eyes scanning the property with a detached, almost dismissive expression. "We'll get to it," he said flatly. Behind him, the other firefighters loitered near the truck, exchanging quiet remarks and barely glancing at the encroaching flames. Miles's jaw tightened. "Get to it? Man, the fire's about to take the whole house. What are you waiting for?" The firefighter's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Look, Mr. Hollywood, we're stretched thin tonight. You're lucky we even made it out here." Lila stepped forward, her voice sharp. "What's that supposed to mean? This is your job. People's lives and homes are on the line." Another firefighter, younger and visibly less experienced, snickered under his breath. "Guess even famous people can't buy their way out of this one." Miles shot him a glare. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" The older man raised a hand to silence the younger firefighter, but the smirk never left his face. "Relax, Mr. Smith. We'll do what we can. Just don't expect miracles." The casual condescension in his tone made Miles's stomach churn. He glanced back at his family, who were watching the interaction with growing unease. Milosau clutched her mother's arm, her wide eyes reflecting the flickering flames. The firefighters finally began moving, but their efforts were sluggish at best. Instead of rushing to assess the situation or deploy hoses, they stood by the truck, exchanging idle comments as if they were on a coffee break. One of them lit a cigarette, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. Miles couldn't believe what he was seeing. He strode up to the group, his voice rising. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you see what's happening here? My family's inside that house, and you're standing around like this is a joke." The bearded firefighter stepped closer, his smirk fading into a hard, almost threatening expression. "You need to calm down, Mr. Smith. We're doing our job." "No, you're not," Miles shot back. "This isn't a movie set. You can't just sit around waiting for someone else to yell action." The younger firefighter snorted, muttering under his breath. "Guess he thinks he's a real hero now." Miles froze, his fists clenching at his sides. Lila stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Miles, don't. They're not worth it." But the damage was done. The team's lack of urgency, their blatant disregard for the situation, and the thinly veiled hostility in their words were too much to ignore. Miles could feel the anger bubbling under his skin, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Do your job. That's all I'm asking." The firefighters finally began deploying a single hose, but their movements were sluggish, almost lazy. One of them sprayed water in a wide arc, barely hitting the advancing flames. Another muttered something about how these rich neighborhoods always think they're special. Inside the house, Jaden and Milesau watched from the window, their faces pale. "Mom," Jaden said quietly, "why aren't they doing anything?" Lila's voice was strained as she replied, "I don't know, baby, but we're going to be okay. Your dad's got this." Miles stood back, watching in disbelief as the team's half-hearted efforts made little to no impact. The fire continued to spread, licking at the edges of the property with increasing ferocity. He glanced at Lila, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "They're not trying," he said, his voice low but seething. "They're letting it burn." Lila looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Miles didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. The action hero, the man who always had a plan, was at the mercy of a system that didn't care. As the fire crept closer, consuming everything in its path, he realized that their night was only just beginning. The air was thick with heat, and the acrid smell of smoke stinging Miles's eyes as he stood helplessly on the patio, watching his world unravel. The fire had reached the edge of the property, devouring the manicured hedges and setting the tall palm trees ablaze. The firefighters' sluggish efforts seemed to mock the urgency of the situation. Each second felt like an eternity as Miles's anger simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. He turned to the bearded firefighter, whose name tag read Maxwell. Maxwell was leaning against the fire truck, casually sipping from a water bottle, as if he were taking a break. Miles stormed toward him, his voice shaking with frustration. "What the hell are you doing? My house is about to go up in flames, and you're standing there like it's a barbecue." Maxwell glanced at him lazily, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Look, Mr. Smith, you need to understand something. We've got bigger priorities tonight. You're not the only one who called." Miles's fists clenched at his sides. Bigger priorities? What could be bigger than stopping this fire before it destroys everything I've worked for? Maxwell smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Let's just say some folks are worth the effort, others not so much." The implication hit Miles like a punch to the gut. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "What are you trying to say?" Another firefighter, a wiry man with a sharp jawline, chimed in from behind Maxwell. "Oh, come on, you know exactly what he's saying. People like you think your money and fame make you untouchable. Guess you're learning otherwise tonight." Lila appeared behind Miles, her face a mask of barely restrained fury. "People like him? What does that even mean? This is blatant racism, and you know it." Maxwell shrugged, unbothered by the accusation. "Call it what you want, lady. Doesn't change the fact that we're here, aren't we? Be grateful, we even showed up." Miles could feel Lila's hand tighten on his arm, a silent plea for him to stay calm. But the condescending smirks and veiled hostility were pushing him to his limit. He pointed towards the house, his voice trembling with anger. "You see that? That's my family in there, my kids. They don't deserve this." The younger firefighter, the one who had made the earlier snide remark, chuckled under his breath. "Maybe they'll write a song about it." The comment cut through Miles's resolve like a blade. His voice rose raw and unfiltered. "You think this is funny? You think watching someone's life burn to the ground is a joke?" Maxwell held up a hand, feigning calm. "All right, let's not get emotional here. We're doing the best we can, but hey, maybe you can use this for your next big role." Lila stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with venom. "You're a disgrace, every single one of you. I hope you're proud of yourselves." For a moment, the group of firefighters exchanged glances, their smirks fading slightly, but the moment passed quickly and they returned to their lackadaisical attitudes. One of them muttered something about celebrities always playing the victim, and Miles felt the surge of hopelessness he hadn't experienced in years. The flames had reached the main house now, their fiery tendrils licking at the wooden beams of the patio. Inside, Miles let out a terrified scream as the windows began to crack under the intense heat. Lila rushed back into the house, gathering the children and urging them toward the back door. "Miles, we need to leave now," she shouted, her voice breaking. Miles turned back to the firefighters one last time, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I'm begging you, just do your job." Maxwell sighed, finally picking up a hose and signaling to his team, but their efforts were half-hearted at best, the water barely reaching the edges of the fire. It was as if they were deliberately letting the house burn, each moment a reminder of their disdain. As the flames consumed the roof, Miles grabbed his family and ushered them toward the car parked in the driveway. He didn't look back as the house he had built, the memories he had cherished, turned into a blazing inferno. The family sat in the car in stunned silence, watching from a distance as their home collapsed under the weight of the fire. Miles sobbed quietly in the back seat, her tears streaking her soot-covered face. Jaden stared out the window, his hands clenched into fists. "Dad," he said after a long pause, his voice trembling, "why didn't they help us?" Miles didn't have an answer. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of pain and fury. Lila reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him, but the anger in her eyes mirrored his own. "They didn't help because they didn't care. she said softly, her voice heavy with bitterness. Because we're not the right kind of people to them. Miles closed his eyes, his mind replaying the sneers and snide remarks of the firefighters. He had faced racism before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about prejudice, it was about power. They had the power to save his home, his memories, and they had chosen not to. As the first rays of dawn broke over the charred remains of their property, Miles made a silent vow. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sun rose reluctantly over the smoldering remains of the Smith family home. Ashes drifted lazily in the morning air, settling on the driveway and the remnants of what had once been a thriving garden. Miles stood outside the car, staring at the blackened skeleton of the house he had built, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Behind him, Lila tried to comfort Milesau, who was curled up in the back seat, her sobs muffled by her arms. Jaden sat silently, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The hum of approaching vehicles broke the somber silence. A swarm of reporters, their vans emblazoned with the logos of major news outlets, descended on the property like vultures to a carcass. Cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every angle of the destruction, while microphones were thrust toward Miles as journalists shouted over one another, "Mr. Smith, can you tell us what happened? Is your family safe? What do you have to say about the firefighters' response?" Miles raised a hand, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and barely contained rage. "Not now," he said, his voice firm but weary. But the questions kept coming, their persistence gnawing at him. Finally, Lila stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "Our home is gone," she said, her voice sharp and cutting, and not just because of the fire. The people who were supposed to help us, who were supposed to protect us, stood by and did nothing. That's the story you should be telling. The reporters fell momentarily silent, stunned by the raw emotion in her words. Then, as if a dam had broken, the questions began anew, but this time they were sharper, more pointed. "What do you mean by did nothing, Mrs. Smith? Are you saying the firefighters failed in their duties? Do you believe this was intentional?" Miles stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Lila's shoulder. "What we're saying," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, "is that the team that came here last night treated us like we didn't matter. They mocked us, they delayed, and they let our home burn because they didn't care." The reporters exchanged glances, their pens scribbling furiously. One journalist, a young black woman with a badge that read La Chronicle, stepped closer. "Mr. Smith, are you implying that race played a role in how you were treated?" Miles hesitated for a moment, the weight of the question settling heavily on his shoulders. Then he nodded, his eyes hard. "I'm not implying it. I'm saying it outright. The way they spoke to us, the way they acted, it wasn't just neglect, it was deliberate." The statement hit like a thunderclap. Within hours, clips of Miles's impromptu press conference spread across social media, sparking a wildfire of its own. The hashtags #Justice for Miles and #Firefighters Accountability began trending worldwide. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary people alike voiced their outrage, sharing their own experiences of systemic racism and calling for action. The Los Angeles Fire Department released a brief statement defending their efforts and denying any allegations of misconduct. "Our teams are working tirelessly to combat the ongoing wildfires," it read. "We take any accusations seriously, and Miles investigate thoroughly." But for Miles and Lila, the words felt hollow. They knew what they had experienced. They knew the truth. That evening, Miles sat in the living room of a friend's home, scrolling through his phone. Messages of support poured in from every corner of the globe, but among them were also messages of hate and dismissal. "You're just playing the race card," one comment read. "Maybe if you weren't so entitled, your house would still be standing," said another. Lila placed a hand on his shoulder, startling him out of his thoughts. "You can't let them get to you," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his voice heavy, "but it's hard not to." She nodded, sitting beside him. "What's our next move?" Miles set his phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "We fight. We make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The next day, Miles and Lila appeared on several major news programs, recounting their experience in harrowing detail. They spoke of the firefighters' racist remarks, their refusal to act, and the devastating consequences. Their story ignited a firestorm of debate. Some praised their courage while others accused them of seeking attention. As the public outcry grew, Calls for accountability intensified. Protesters gathered outside fire department headquarters, demanding transparency and reform. Community leaders and activists joined the cause, turning it into a rallying cry for justice. Meanwhile, Miles received an email from a neighbor who had witnessed the events of that night. Attached was a video taken from a security camera, capturing the firefighters' behavior. The footage showed them laughing, smoking, and making dismissive comments as the fire raged on. Miles watched the video with a mix of anger and vindication. This was the proof they needed. He forwarded it to his lawyer with a single line: "Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." That evening, Miles sat with his family watching the news coverage. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice for the Smiths" and "End Racism" in emergency services. The story had become bigger than them, a symbol of a systemic problem that could no longer be ignored. As the flames of outrage continued to spread, Miles felt a renewed sense of purpose. His home was gone, but his fight was just beginning. The Smith household story had become the center of a national conversation. News outlets dissected every detail, and debates raged across social media. Was this an isolated incident of negligence, or was it symptomatic of a deeper systemic issue within emergency services? Miles and Lila sat in their temporary home, a modest rental offered by a close friend. The sterile walls and sparse furniture made it feel like a far cry from the warm, inviting space they'd once called home. Miles's phone buzzed constantly, with messages from friends, fans, and activists, all offering their support. But it wasn't the messages of support that consumed Miles's attention. It was the email he received the night before. The video evidence sent by a neighbor was a bombshell. He had spent hours watching it, his emotions swinging between fury and disbelief. The footage was damning. It showed the firefighters lounging by their truck, laughing, and making comments as the fire consumed his home. At one point, one firefighter, Maxwell, was clearly heard saying, "Let it burn. He's got insurance, probably more money than we'll see in a lifetime." Another voice chimed in, "And here I thought these folks didn't like fire. Guess we proved that wrong tonight." The casual cruelty in their voices made Miles's stomach churn. He knew this video had the power to change everything. The next morning, Miles and Lila sat down with their lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Madeline Brooks. Madeline had built her career on cases of racial discrimination and was known for her unrelenting determination. She leaned forward in her chair, her sharp eyes fixed on Miles. "This video," she said, tapping her pen against the table, "isn't just proof of negligence. It's proof of intent. They didn't just fail to do their jobs, they deliberately chose not to." Lila nodded, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "We need to make sure they're held accountable, not just for us, but for everyone else they might have done this to." Madeline smiled grimly. "That's exactly what we're going to do. But be prepared, they're going to fight back hard. The fire department has a lot to lose." Miles's voice was steady as he replied, "So do we. And we're not backing down." The investigation officially began later that week. The Los Angeles Fire Department, under immense public pressure, announced that they were conducting an internal review of the incident. But Miles and Lila weren't content to leave it in their hands. They knew the system was stacked against them. With Madeline's help, they filed a formal complaint, citing negligence, discrimination, and misconduct. The complaint was accompanied by the video evidence, which Madeline had already shared with several news outlets. Within hours of its release, the video went viral. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Protesters gathered outside fire department headquarters, chanting slogans like "Justice for the Smiths" and "End Racism Now." Civil rights organizations issued statements of support, and several prominent figures in the entertainment industry pledged to stand with the Smiths. But the backlash was just as fierce. On conservative talk shows and social media, critics accused the Smiths of exploiting the tragedy for attention. "They're trying to play the victim," one commentator sneered. "Typical Hollywood elitists." Miles refused to be deterred. "Let them say what they want," he told Lila that evening. "This isn't about them. This is about doing what's right." As the investigation progressed, more evidence began to surface. Former colleagues of the firefighters involved came forward, sharing stories of similar incidents. One retired firefighter, an older black man named Marcus Reed, gave a powerful interview to a major news outlet. "I worked with Maxwell for years," Marcus said. "He's always been like this, always had a chip on his shoulder when it came to people of color. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a culture that's been allowed to fester. The fire department's leadership scrambled to contain the fallout. They suspended Maxwell and the others involved in the Smith case, but the public demanded more. Madeline filed a motion to subpoena the fire department's records, and what they found was damning. Internal emails and reports revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior within the department. Complaints from minority residents were routinely dismissed, and several firefighters had been accused of making racist remarks while on duty. None of these complaints had ever led to significant consequences. Miles and Lila watched the news coverage from their rental home, their emotions a mix of anger and vindication. The story was no longer just about their family. It was about a system that had failed countless others. "I can't believe this has been going on for so long," Lila said, shaking her head. "How many people have suffered because of them?" Miles placed a hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can make sure it doesn't keep happening." As the investigation neared its conclusion, Madeline called them with an update. "The fire department is offering a settlement," she said. "They're trying to avoid a lawsuit." Miles didn't hesitate. "We're not taking their money. This isn't about a payout." Madeline smiled. "I thought you'd say that. We'll see them in court." The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Rows of seats were filled with reporters, activists, and members of the public who had followed the Smiths' case from the beginning. At the front of the room sat Miles and Lila, their faces resolute. Behind them, supporters held quiet, determined expressions, many wearing pins that read "Justice for the Smiths." On the opposite side of the courtroom sat the suspended firefighters, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease. Maxwell, the grizzled leader of the team, sat with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard line. His lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney with a reputation for defending controversial clients, whispered something to him, but Maxwell's expression didn't change. The judge entered the room, and the murmurs in the crowd died down. The trial began. The first few days were dominated by opening statements and procedural discussions. Madeline Brooks, the Smiths' attorney, stood before the jury with confidence. She painted a vivid picture of the night the fire destroyed the Smiths' home, emphasizing the firefighters' deliberate inaction and discriminatory behavior. "These men," she said, gesturing toward the defendants, "were not just negligent. They made a conscious choice to withhold help from a family in desperate need, and they did so because of who that family was." The defense attorney countered, arguing that the firefighters were overwhelmed by the scale of the fires and had done their best under the circumstances. "This was a tragedy," he said, "but it was not malicious. My clients are being scapegoated for a situation that was out of their control." But the tide began to turn when Madeline presented the video evidence. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on a large screen. The jury watched as the firefighters lounged by their truck, laughing and making dismissive comments. Maxwell's voice echoed through the room. "Let it burn. He's got insurance, probably more money than we'll see in a lifetime." The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Madeline paused the video and turned to the jury. "This is not the behavior of overwhelmed professionals," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This is the behavior of individuals who chose to let a family suffer because they thought it was funny, because they thought it didn't matter." Over the next week, Madeline called several witnesses to the stand. Marcus Reed, the retired firefighter who had worked with Maxwell, gave damning testimony. "Maxwell always had a problem with people of color," Marcus said, his voice steady but emotional. "He'd make comments, jokes, things that had no place in a firehouse. And it wasn't just him. There's a culture in that department that needs to change." The defense tried to discredit Marcus, suggesting that he had a personal vendetta against Maxwell, but his calm demeanor and detailed accounts made a strong impression on the jury. Next, Madeline presented the internal emails and complaints she had obtained during the investigation. The documents revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior within the fire department, including incidents where minority residents had received delayed or inadequate responses to emergencies. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense attempted to mount a counter-argument, calling character witnesses to testify on behalf of the firefighters. They portrayed Maxwell and his team as hardworking individuals who had been unfairly vilified. But their case crumbled when one of the firefighters, under cross-examination, admitted to making the comments heard in the video. "I didn't mean it seriously," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "It was just a joke." Madeline pounced on his admission. A joke while a family's home was burning down? Is that what you call professionalism? The firefighter had no response. As the trial drew to a close, Madeline delivered a powerful closing argument. She spoke directly to the jury, her voice unwavering. "This case is not just about the Smith family," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of their race or background, is treated as less than human. The evidence is clear. These men had the power to help, and they chose not to. They must be held responsible." The defense's closing argument was far less impactful, relying on vague appeals to the challenges of firefighting and the unpredictability of wildfires. By the time they finished, it was clear that the jury's sympathies lay with the Smiths. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read the decision: guilty. The firefighters were found liable for negligence, misconduct, and discrimination. Maxwell and his team were ordered to pay significant damages to the Smiths, and the fire department faced an independent review of its policies and practices. The reaction in the courtroom was electric. Supporters of the Smiths hugged and cheered, while Maxwell and his team sat in stunned silence. Miles and Lila held hands tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Justice had been served. That evening, Miles stood before a crowd of supporters outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed as he addressed the crowd, his voice filled with emotion. "This isn't just a victory for my family," he said. "It's a victory for everyone who's ever been told that their lives don't matter. We've shown that when we stand together, we can demand accountability. We can create change." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing into the night. As Miles and Lila drove home, they reflected on the journey they had been through. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done to address the systemic issues that had allowed this to happen. But for the first time since the fire, they felt a glimmer of hope. Their home was gone, but they had built something far more powerful, a movement for justice. The sun set gently over Los Angeles, its golden light spilling over the rooftops and casting long shadows on the city below. Miles sat on the balcony of their temporary home, his laptop glowing faintly in the twilight. He scrolled through an endless stream of emails, many from people who had reached out to share their own stories of discrimination, negligence, and loss. Lila joined him, a mug of tea in her hands. She leaned on the railing, her eyes scanning the horizon as she spoke softly. "They're looking to you, you know. People see what we've done, and now they're hoping we'll keep fighting for them too." Miles nodded, his face thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that, about how many people go through this but don't have the platform to make their voices heard. We've been lucky, Lila. We've lost so much, but we still have the means to rebuild. A lot of people don't." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "What are you thinking?" Miles took a deep breath, his mind racing. "I'm thinking about a foundation, something that doesn't just focus on fighting discrimination, but also helps people rebuild after disasters. Families like ours who lose everything and don't know where to start." Lila smiled, a spark of hope in her eyes. "That's a beautiful idea, Miles. We can use what we've been through to make a real difference." The idea quickly took shape over the next few weeks. Miles and Lila poured their energy into establishing the foundation, which they decided to call the Phoenix Fund, a symbol of rising from the ashes stronger than before. The name resonated with their story and the countless others they hoped to help. The first step was assembling a team of experts and advisors. Miles reached out to activists, disaster recovery specialists, and community leaders, bringing together a diverse group of passionate individuals. Lila spearheaded the outreach efforts, connecting with families who had experienced similar tragedies and listening to their stories. The stories they heard were heartbreaking. A single mother whose home was destroyed by wildfire and who had been denied adequate assistance because of her zip code. A black business owner whose storefront was looted during a disaster, only to be ignored by local authorities. An elderly couple who lost their home and life savings, left with nowhere to go. Each story fueled their determination to create meaningful change. The official launch of the Phoenix Fund was a star-studded event held in the heart of Los Angeles. Celebrities, activists, and philanthropists gathered to show their support, while families who had been affected by similar disasters shared their stories on stage. The room buzzed with energy, a palpable sense of hope filling the air. Miles took the stage to deliver the keynote address. Dressed simply in a black suit, he stood before the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Losing our home was one of the hardest things my family has ever faced," he began. "But what made it even harder was knowing that it didn't have to happen, that the people who were supposed to help us chose not to. But out of that pain, we found purpose. We realized that our story is not unique. It's part of a much bigger problem, and that's why we're here tonight, to say enough is enough. To say that everyone deserves help when they need it most, regardless of where they live, what they look like, or how much money they have. The Phoenix Fund is about more than just rebuilding homes. It's about rebuilding lives. It's about giving people the support they need to rise from the ashes and create a better future. And we can't do it without you." The room erupted into applause, the crowd rising to their feet. Lila joined him on stage, taking his hand as they stood together, united in their mission. Over the following months, the Phoenix Fund grew rapidly. Donations poured in from around the world, fueled by a viral social media campaign and high-profile endorsements. The foundation launched its first major initiative, a grant program for families affected by wildfires, providing funds for temporary housing, rebuilding costs, and mental health support. Miles and Lila were deeply involved in the work. They visited communities devastated by disasters, meeting with families and listening to their needs. They worked closely with local organizations to ensure the aid reached those who needed it most. And they continued to use their platform to advocate for systemic change, pushing for reforms in emergency services and disaster response. One day, during a visit to a small town in Northern California that had been nearly wiped out by a wildfire, Miles met a young boy named Marcus. Marcus was no older than 8, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie he wore. He stood with his mother in a makeshift shelter, his eyes wide with curiosity as he recognized Miles. "You're the guy from the movies," Marcus said shyly, clutching a battered toy truck. Miles crouched down to meet his gaze, smiling warmly. "Yeah, that's me, but today I'm just here to help." Marcus's mother, a tired-looking woman with soot-streaked cheeks, stepped forward. "Thank you," she said quietly. "What you're doing, it gives people like us hope." Miles felt a lump form in his throat. He looked around the room at the families who had lost so much, their resilience shining through despite the odds. This was why he and Lila had started the Phoenix Fund. This was their purpose. By the end of the year, the Phoenix Fund had provided aid to hundreds of families and sparked a nationwide conversation about equity and disaster response. The Smiths had turned their tragedy into a force for good, proving that even in the face of unimaginable loss, it was possible to create something powerful and lasting. One evening, as Miles and Lila sat together reviewing the foundation's progress, Lila leaned over and kissed his cheek. "You've done something incredible, Miles." "We've done something incredible," he smiled, his eyes full of gratitude. "We're just getting started." The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink as the sun set over the charred remains of what had once been the Smith family home. Miles stood silently at the edge of the property, the warm breeze carrying the faint scent of ash. The land had been cleared of debris, leaving behind a barren open space. It was a stark reminder of all that had been lost, but also of the new beginning it symbolized. In his hand, he held a small polished stone engraved with the words, "From ashes we rise." It was a gift from a family the Phoenix Fund had helped rebuild their lives. The weight of it in his palm felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the hopes and gratitude of every person the foundation had touched. Lila joined him, slipping her hand into his. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with him, gazing at the land where they had built their lives together. After a moment, she spoke softly. "You know, I used to think of this place as the center of everything, our family, our memories. But now," she paused, searching for the right words. "Now I realize it's not about the place. It's about us, what we've built together, and what we're building now." Miles nodded, his throat tight. Losing this house, it felt like the end of the world. But you're right, it's not about the walls or the roof. It's about the people inside, and the work we're doing now, helping other families find their way. It's bigger than anything I could have imagined. Months had passed since the trial, and life had begun to take on a new rhythm. The Phoenix Fund was thriving, its reach expanding far beyond Los Angeles. Families from across the country had reached out, sharing their stories of survival and resilience. The foundation had not only provided immediate aid, but also lobbied for systemic reforms in emergency services, pushing for equity and accountability at every level. Miles and Lila had become symbols of hope and perseverance, their story inspiring others to stand up against injustice. They had faced backlash, of course. There were always those who sought to diminish their efforts or question their motives, but the overwhelming support they received far outweighed the negativity. One of the most rewarding moments came during a visit to a newly rebuilt community in Northern California. The Phoenix Fund had worked closely with local organizations to help residents recover after a devastating wildfire. As Miles and Lila walked through the neighborhood, they were greeted with smiles, handshakes, and heartfelt thanks. A woman approached them, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been older than 6. "This is Emily," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "When we lost everything, we didn't know where to turn, but your foundation, it saved us. We have a home again because of you." Miles knelt down to Emily's level, his smile warm. "You know something, Emily? You're stronger than you think, and your mom, she's a superhero." Emily giggled, her shy smile brightening her face. The moment was small, but it stayed with Miles long after they returned home. Back at the property, Miles and Lila stood together as the first construction vehicles arrived. They had decided to rebuild, not the same house, but something new, a symbol of their journey and the hope they wanted to pass on. The new home would include a community center, a space for meetings and workshops where local families could gather, share resources, and support one another. As the workers began unloading materials, Lila looked at Miles with a soft smile. "This isn't just for us, is it?" Miles shook his head. "No, it's for everyone who needs to know they're not alone, that no matter how bad it gets, there's always a way forward." That evening, as the first beams were laid, Miles stood on the empty lot watching the sun dip below the horizon. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain, the loss, the anger. But he also thought about the strength they had found, the lives they had touched, and the legacy they were building. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small engraved stone, kneeling to place it at the edge of the property, burying it just deep enough that it would stay hidden, a quiet reminder of everything they had overcome. As he stood, Lila called to him from the house they were temporarily staying in. The voices of their children echoed in the distance, laughter ringing out against the fading light. Miles smiled, his heart full. From ashes they had risen, not just as a family, but as a force for change. And while the road ahead would not always be easy, they were ready to face it together. Because in the end, it wasn't about what they had lost, it was about what they had found. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new stories, and hit the bell to stay up to date. Share this video with your friends to discuss what you think happened. In the meantime, check out our other videos. There are even more incredible stories. See you soon.